Well, I want to be mindful of everyone's time, so I'm going to go ahead and start, and then so we can start today's C2HR learning series. Hi, everyone. I'm Parthivi Das, Executive Director of C2HR, and I'm excited to welcome you to today's HR learning series, which is going to focus on Natalie Nixon's new book, Move, Rest, Think. Some of you may have had the opportunity to hear Natalie speak at C2HR Con this summer. Natalie is a creativity strategist and leadership advisor who is one of the top 50 keynote speakers in the world. As the founder and leader of Figure Eight Thinking, Natalie helps clients leverage creativity to more rapidly achieve business goals, spark innovation, and strategize for the future of work. Today, she's going to introduce Move, Think, Rest, which equips teams with more curiosity, adaptability, and impact. As burnout rates are increasing and AI is reshaping every industry, she's going to share how companies can shift the focus from output to impact by sharing actionable strategies to help future-proof your organization. C2HR is able to offer free quality educational programs for our members, like today's learning series, thanks to the generous support of our 2025 sponsors. We sincerely appreciate your support. Before we start today's session, we want to invite you to join us for our next HR Learning Series on November the 12th, which will focus on evolving state of talent and bridging skill gaps. To register, please come to our website, c2hr.org. We would like today's webinar to be interactive and invite you to post questions in the chat throughout the session and keep your questions for the end. SHRM has approved this webinar for 1 CE credit, and the credit code will be emailed to all our participants after the event. Natalie, I would like to thank you again for joining us today, and I would like to turn the conversation over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Parthavi. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Thanks, Tracy, for being here as well. And to get started, I'm always interested to know who's here. So if you don't mind, this will also be a bit of practice in case you're rusty. Just drop into the chat what company you're from or however much you want to share. I would love to know, just get a sense of who my audience is today. So just drop into the chat which firm you're with. If you want to share also your title, that would be super helpful. Thank you. Nice. Thanks, Carrie. Charter. So we have wow, nice. Midco, wonderful. Anyone else? Thank you. A plus E. Good to see you again, to Ravina. Comcast, wonderful. I'm in Philadelphia, original home of Comcast. I know it's not NBC Universal. James Search, nice. Midco, okay. Thank you. An A plus C. Well, please continue to add to the chat. I welcome that. So what I'd like to do today is share an overview of how the Move, Think, Rest human operating system can be useful to you as individuals, as leaders, and to integrate into your teams. And probably be about 25, 30 minutes in all. And I would love to have you pose questions. So if you don't mind, save your questions for the end, but make sure you're jotting them down. And there will be a moment where we ask for questions. There is one interactive moment. We have a poll kind of towards the beginning of my presentation. So be ready to participate in the poll. Okay, thanks everyone. I'm going to begin. So the title of what we're talking about today is around this idea of shifting from burnout to breakthrough. As Parthavi mentioned, I'm Dr. Natalie Nixon. Want to be super appreciative of the sponsors from Charter, Deloitte, NBC Universal, Warner Brothers, Cox, Cablefax, Kelly Dry, Media, ZRG, and the Lawrence Advisory. Thank you very much for your support. Sorry. Okay. And you get a 1 hour credit for having attended throughout all the way to the end. So We're talking about shifting from burnout to breakthrough, specifically by applying the Move, Think, Rest operating system. And I want to start with a story. It harkens back to a month before I graduated from college. The front page of the New York Times proclaimed that the class of 1991 graduates into a recession. Not the most hopeful front page to see when you are a senior in college about to start working. What's most noteworthy for me about that front page is that I actually had a job. I had a job going into a fellowship in New York City called the Urban Fellows Program. And I want to share that I think the reason I got that job was not because I majored in the right major. I remember at the second round of interviews, I was surrounded in the waiting room by, you know, urban studies majors from Stanford and political science majors from Harvard and government relations majors from Georgetown University. And I was an anthropology major from a small liberal arts college in the Hudson Valley. But when it came time in the interview for that question of, so Natalie, why should we select you? Even though I was so nervous in that waiting room, I decided to lean into the distinctive way I thought about the world and societal problems. And I said, well, because I study cultural anthropology, I will add the worm's eye view of society. I'm trained to ask questions from deep observation, participant inquiry, interviews, and qualitative research. And I saw something shift in the woman who was interviewing me, and I kind of knew instinctively. I thought, I think I got this job, even though I'm so different from everyone else in that waiting room. Spoiler alert, I did get the job. I entered summer of 1991 with a job despite the recession. And I'm telling that story because that way of thinking, of shifting the way I think to think differently, has been an incredible advantage and strategic advantage. And I share that story because that's a lot of how I want to couch the way you're thinking about yourselves, about your work, about who and how you hire, especially in this time of very anxious change. It turns out that thinking differently isn't rebellious. Thinking differently helps us to renew. It helps us to renew on a personal level. It also adds that renewal value to the organizations and teams in which we are a part. When we think differently, it's how we move from status quo, from what is, from feeling stuck to what is totally possible. I want to lean into some disturbing statistics about the Gen Z generation. And the reason I'm doing that is not because I think that you all are Gen Z. You'd be pretty impressive managers of HR if you were Gen Z. But I want to share this data because these are the people who you are recruiting, who you will be cultivating into leaders. And I think it's important that we understand the labor supply and what we're working with and what value they can add and what their needs are so that we can design the best organizations possible to do the work that you all are committed to doing. So the headline, unfortunately, is that college age Gen Z students are navigating a crisis today. They're navigating a crisis of feeling overwhelmed and underconnected. The statistics around that overwhelmed feeling and underconnection are pretty staggering. One survey showed that 46% of Gen Z individuals report having received a formal mental health diagnosis. That's almost half. 44% of young adults ages 18 to 24 report persistent feelings of anxiety and being nervous and on edge. And what that equates to, and maybe kind of the source of that, is they really are equating busyness with success. Now, some of that equating busyness with success is related to social media, which is highly performative. It's where we show our greatest hits, Natalie's greatest hits, best of, right? It's not representative of the way I really feel 24/7, but it's kind of this showing off that I'm shining all the time 24/7, which of course is not sustainable. It's not realistic. And it's affecting the way young people, Gen Z, are showing up and thinking the way they need to model work. The Wiley State of the Student survey showed that it's symptomatic of a culture that rewards volume over focus. So, one of my first queries to you is, wonder where young people learned this behavior from. I wonder where they got these lessons of volume over focus, that busyness is equivalent to productivity. Well, we don't need to look too far from, we can look in the mirror. They're learning it from us. They're learning it from, I'll call them geriatric millennials, from solid Gen Xers like myself, from boomers. And 71% of the knowledge workers reported burnout in 2020, and that number has not decreased. There's a big cost to burnout. It turns out that on an annual basis, it costs about $300 billion in terms of what absenteeism and turnover and knowledge transfer and lower productivity and insurance costs all add up to on an annual basis. So this is not just an inconvenience. If you don't want to indulge in the human dimension of work, but I know you all do because you are all are HR executives, we at least as business owners need to acknowledge the business costs if we do not acknowledge this. And what I'm here to share with you today is a functional, practical operating system to address this enormous cost and to address this human need. It turns out that we need a compass to navigate forward, and the compass is a metaphor I love to use because an instruction manual won't cut it. That's too cut and dry. And we all know that we are in a VUCA environment that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So things are constantly changing. Even a roadmap really won't make sense because of the constant change. So as soon as you think you've nailed it, there's another disruptor, either geopolitical or market uncertainty. All right. So those sorts of quixotic changes means we need to identify our true north. If you have a compass, and that's what I'm going to equip you with today, you're able to navigate from your true north and then figure out which way is east, south, and west. I learned this personally firsthand as an open water swimmer. Now, don't get too impressed. This is me feeling dog tired, being last. You see that there's lake weed strewn all over my face. I wanted to quit in this moment, but the coach who was kayaking beside me, at that moment, she snapped that photograph, and her assistant later yelled out to me, "You're doing great." When you do open water swimming, you have to deal with shifting currents. You have to deal with lake weed and seaweed. You have to deal with a beautiful rainbow that might appear or a school of fish. But you keep your line of sight on a particular, in a natural landscape, it might be a mountain peak, but you also know you have to have intermediary lines of sight. Similarly, when you're equipped with a compass, it doesn't matter if the currents change. It doesn't matter if you get disruptions, good or bad, because you're able to have a line of sight that you are equipped with. And this is important because we're in the middle of a human revolution, not a tech revolution. I know you think you're in a tech revolution because you feel swamped by all the technological adoption, but here's the thing. If we play our cards right, the technology is there to leverage what makes us uniquely human. That's the goal. And that's what's really important to remember. So, because of that, I want to welcome you wholeheartedly to the imagination era, to a time where technology can be leveraged to optimize what makes us uniquely human. In the imagination era, human consciousness, curiosity, intuition, collaboration. In other words, the flagship headline is that soft skills are hardcore in this imagination era. The technology and the human dimension optimally should be working hand in hand. And thinking differently is your ultimate strategic advantage. It's your individual strategic advantage. It's your team's strategic advantage. It is your organization's strategic advantage. So what I help organizations to do is to equip their culture with tools and ways to consistently think differently so that they can navigate these levels of ubiquitous change. I just want to give you three examples of people and institutions and companies historically who've thought differently to their strategic advantage. The first example is Grace Hopper. Grace Hopper is considered the grandmama of artificial intelligence. She's considered the grandmama of artificial intelligence because she figured out how to have computers talk to each other instead of back in the 1930s and 40s when Grace earned her bachelor's degree in mathematics from Vassar College. She earned her PhD in math from Yale University in 1934. She went on to serve in the Navy during World War II, where she helped to design code that would divert torpedoes. She then became an admiral in the Navy years later. And Grace Hopper also is the co-creator of COBOL, COBOL, the business computing language. So she was a pretty bad girl. She's pretty amazing. And the ways that she thought differently that give her the credit of being the grandmama of artificial intelligence is that back in the 30s and 40s when computers took up an entire floor of a building, humans used to run back and forth with paper or punch holes, one lines and circles, ones and zeros, and insert into the computers. And she thought that's kind of inefficient. What if we figured out a way for computers to talk to one another? Which, bingo, is really the genesis of what we now understand to be AI. So we can credit Grace Hopper for that. But that's not why I'm bringing her up. I'm bringing her up because when she first graduated from Yale, she went back to her alma mater, Vassar College, taught in the mathematics department. And here's what her biographer, Kurt Beyer, points out that in her probability course, she would begin with a lecture on one of her favorite mathematical formulas. And she wasn't just interested in the students figuring out the formula. She would ask her students to write an essay about the formula, and she would grade them based on their clarity of writing and style. You may think, fantastic, that's such a creative, innovative way to teach mathematics. Her colleagues, the other faculty at Vassar in the math department, hated it. They thought, why is she wasting time doing this? But that's just one example of how her type of beautiful brain worked, how she thought differently and enabled people to understand math as code. Math is another sort of language. And that's just one snippet and nugget of an example of what she took forward in her career. So Grace Hopper is one example of thinking differently. Another example are the founders of Airbnb. You may or may not be aware that it's called Airbnb because the founders of Airbnb were in San Francisco during a big design conference. Hotels were totally booked. They blew up 3 air mattresses in their apartment and let out the sleeping quarters in their small apartment to people attending the conference who had no place else to stay. And that was the nugget of an idea that formed the following question. What if we could convince total strangers to allow another group of strangers into their home? What if we could convince people to trust strangers instead of a hotel? And so they shifted from a business model that was just transactional to a business model that was based on an emotional driver, specifically trust. In the beginning days of building their company and building their business, it wasn't like people were trying to write tons of checks for Airbnb. It took them a while, but they stuck to their commitment to solving this emotional problem. They thought differently. A third example of thinking very differently as a strategic advantage is Netflix. Some of you may remember that back in the day, Netflix was a company that would send out mailers of movies on DVDs. And when streaming first arrived on the landscape, they didn't freak out and say, oh no, how are we going to smash the competitor of streaming? They've got to go. We've got to maintain our market share doing the same thing we've always done. No, they asked a different question. They said, what is the future of consuming entertainment? What if geography won't matter in the ways that people consume entertainment? And because of their ability to think differently as individuals, as teams, as leaders, and mentioned this entire organization, they were able to become the Netflix that we all know so well today. So those three examples, Grace Hopper, Airbnb, and Netflix, are all great examples of thinking differently. And they basically are examples of being able to zig away from where everyone else is zagging. I learned this principle of zigging away when everyone else is zagging when I worked in the fashion industry. In the fashion industry, you know that whatever collection you launch, it will be knocked off. That's not an if, that's a when. So, because of that, you learn very quickly to be adaptive and to quickly not just follow the crowd and do it and copy paste and do what everyone else is doing, but to think very differently about things. In fact, a lot of the ways I've helped clients is there's a thinking like a fashion designer series of facilitations I've done for tech companies and healthcare companies and financial services companies. The takeaway is that in a world where we can work from anywhere, where technology is ubiquitous, where burnout is at an epidemic rate, as I've just demonstrated, you need a new compass. And that compass, I believe, needs to be your creative capacity as an organization, as a team, and as individuals. So let's pause here. Here's the first interactive question. And Tracy, this is where I need your help. There's a poll that Tracy's going to share, and it's this question. On a scale of 1 to 5, one being, meh, not really, to 5, yes. How creative would you say you are? Please answer the poll. Just curious. Are you not so creative? 1, 2, are you super creative? 4, 5, are you in the middle? And Tracy, you let me know what people are responding. Okay, awesome. All right, so 35% are around a 4. No one said 1. Okay, I love that. That's wonderful. And then some people feel like I'm like a 2, 3. Okay, and a few people a couple people say yes, absolutely, I'm creative. Thank you so much for sharing that. I always like to see that because a lot of the time when we think about the word creative and creativity, we think of musicians, we think of painters, we think of dancers. And in the early days of building my company, I would get invited into big Fortune 500 companies to help them build cultures of innovation. And slowly but surely, the work wasn't really germinating throughout the organization. And I suspected it was because we were starting in the wrong place. We needed to start with building creativity as a capacity. But here's the challenge. If I were to go into the hallowed halls of a lot of these Fortune 500 companies and say, hey guys, we actually should be starting with creativity if we want to become an innovative company, they would have looked at me like I had 3 heads because they only associated creativity with art, right? With visual art, with music, with dance. And so thus began my work to research and build a unique way to help people understand creativity and to access creativity, even especially if you are not an artist. And I developed the wonder rigor theory. And the wonder rigor theory is essentially this. It answers the question of what is creativity in the following way. That it's your ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems, produce novel value, and generate meaning. If you think about creativity in that way, then you realize that the best CHROs and HR directors and executive assistants and plumbers and engineers and scientists and farmers and artists are super creative when they're doing this toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems. Now, if you heard me speak back in the summer in July in Brooklyn, some of this may be familiar, but it bears repeating. So, the ways I want you to think about wonder are that wonder is about audacity and awe and dreaming and curiosity and pausing because it's really hard to wonder when you're going 80 miles an hour. Socrates said that wonder is the beginning of wisdom, right? So some really smart people historically have paid a lot of attention to wonder. But then there's rigor. Rigor is focus and discipline and technique and time on task. And rigor is kind of laborious. It's not particularly fun. Rigor is also the essential dimension of creativity. And Leonardo da Vinci said that any obstacle can be destroyed through rigor. So we need both wonder and rigor to build our capacity for creativity and to consistently and sustainably innovate. Wonder is found in the midst of rigor, and rigor cannot be sustained without wonder. You spend too much time, you're hitting the clouds, and you'll get no traction. You spend too much time in the weeds and the minutia, you're going to burn out. So you need to design systems and work processes to toggle between wonder and rigor. It turns out I'm not the only one who thinks that creativity is pretty prescient. The World Economic Forum has named creativity as the number 2 job skill by 2027. Market Splash research has shown that 90% of business leaders believe that creativity is essential for market competitiveness. But here's the rub. 75% of people believe they're not living up to their potential creatively. Some of you may be feeling that way. And it behooves us in a time of AI where basic tasks can be taken over, that we elevate the human dimension and the uniquely human capabilities of creativity. This is where your compass of applying creativity comes in hand. Now, how are you going to do that? Well, I just wrote a book called Move, Think, Rest. And it's a book that offers a human centered operating system. It's one on ramp to help you do this toggling between wonder rigor to apply the wonder rigor theory. And it's a fresh take on productivity. Historically, the way we've thought about productivity is a very either or process. Productivity is based on speed, efficiency, you measure what you can see, and it's outputs based. The thing about that view of productivity is it's deeply rooted to the first industrial revolution of 2 centuries ago, of the 19th century. Meanwhile, GDP doesn't even capture search engines, it doesn't capture email, to the basic functions that you and I use every day to be productive. So, what I've written about in this book is I propose a very fresh and innovative way for us to think about productivity and to shift to a cultivation model. And what I'm proposing is that instead of asking, how might I be more productive today? Or how might my team be more productive this quarter? You should be asking a very different question. You should be asking, what might I cultivate today? And what might my team cultivate this quarter? Because cultivation is a both and model. And I'll get into that both and model in a moment. Here's the basic takeaways. Our ideas move when we move. Innovation will get an upgrade when you do backcast thinking and forecast thinking. And you need to understand that rest is not a reward, it's not a perk. It is an essential component of work, and all of my research bears fruit to this. So, Move, Think, Rest is a book that a lot of you have been gifted. Thank you very much, C2HR. And I just want to dive into some of the key takeaways from this book as, again, as I say, an on-ramp to help you build creativity as a capacity. It's a compass that you can begin to institute. Here's the Move, Think, Rest or motor framework in a nutshell. When I talk about movement, I'm not just talking about make sure you exercise. Of course, that matters. But what I'm talking about is movement hygiene. Just as you have washing your hands hygiene, you want to make sure that you're integrating movement regularly throughout the day. That could be stretching, that could be standing up after 30 to 45-minute increments at the desk sitting. P.S. You really shouldn't be sitting for longer than about 45 minutes at any given time. Thinking is not just about critical, rational thinking, it's about backcasting and forecasting. Backcasting is the role of memory and reflection. Forecasting is the role of curiosity and inspiration and dreaming and daydreaming. The brain works optimally when we're activating the neural synapses that allow us to do the backcasting and forecasting so that the real sharp cognitive thinking can happen. And then there's intermittent rest. I'm not saying that every office building needs to have a nap room. What I'm talking about is making sure that you're taking micro breaks throughout the day. I'm talking about 90-second breaks, 5-minute breaks, 7-minute breaks, that you don't have back-to-back Zoom meetings, but also scaling out rest in terms of thinking about sabbatical. So I interviewed almost 60 people for Move, Think, Rest, and it turns out that nonprofit organizations offer sabbaticals, tech companies offer sabbaticals. Sometimes they're after every 5 years. But here's the thing. A lot of people are not taking the sabbaticals because it's not modeled for them. So we have to shift those sorts of behaviors. So here's what I meant when I said the Move, Think, Rest framework is a both and model. While the old way of thinking about productivity from the first industrial revolution was about speed, efficiency, outputs, this cultivation model is a both and model because it values slow and quick spurts of growth. It values the solo practitioner and the collective. And it values what's happening on the dormant invisible plane as well as the visible plane. This is all related to the reality that we as humans are sentient beings. We sense make through a lot of different signals. A lot of it is powered by the vagus nerve, which is the longest cranial nerve in the body. It extends from the base of the brain, the medulla oblongata, down through the heart and lungs into the gut. So when we say things like, my gut is telling me, it literally is. And we are pulling data from a number of sensorial sources throughout the day, not just from what's on the Excel sheet. So, for example, there was this really cool research study on something called interoception. Interoception is your awareness of your internal state of being. I feel cold. I feel hot. I feel calm. I feel scared. I feel hungry. I feel tired. These are all the signals from interoception. In this experiment, people were asked to sit on a chair, feet on the ground, hands on the lap, and to tap out the rate of their pulse without touching their wrist, right? And people who were excellent at what they called interoceptive awareness and accuracy, it turns out were outstanding strategic decision makers. So in that study, participants with higher interoceptive accuracy make 26% more advantageous decisions in a risk-based task compared to those with lower accuracy. What's the takeaway? You need to slow down. You need to fire up that vagus nerve and that ability to have interoceptive awareness if you want to be a high performing strategist in your organization. This is all because when we pause, when we slow down through the move, think, rest framework as individuals, as teams, as organizations, we actually activate the default mode network personally in the body. The default mode network are those regions in the brain that turn on when we tap out of the world, when we're in the shower, when we are waking up from a nice nap, when we go on a long walk, or a short walk, when we are in an engaging conversation with a friend, right? It's allowing different neural synapses to activate so that when we go back to the work at hand, all of a sudden the answer is clearer. How many of you have experienced that, right? Where you step away from your laptop after being stuck, you do something else, you think you're not working. It turns out that's exactly what the brain needs to do its best work. Leaders who can listen to their internal cues, integrate emotional and physiological information much more effectively. They are anchored into an embodied intelligence that supports strategic clarity, intuitive judgment, and resilience in high stakes environments. Isn't that what you all want? And on your teams, isn't that what you want for yourself? You want to be strategic, have strategic clarity, you want to have intuitive judgment, and you want to have resilience in high stakes environments. When you commit to the move, think, rest operating system, two shifts happen. You shift away from burnout to adaptability, and you shift away from a focus on pressure and busyness. Remember that first slide I showed how our young people are equating busyness with productivity? Let's help them shift away from that mindset to a growth mindset, to creativity, and to strategic vision. So at this point, you may be asking, so what? So what if I do all that? What's the point? How is that going to help me in my daily job? So I'm glad that you may have asked that. Let me share a couple of thoughts about the so what. I want you to think about why this matters from one of my favorite frameworks that comes from design thinking work, which is that if you understand the problem you're solving from a functional, social, and emotional dimension, you are guaranteed to be innovating. If you're only answering a problem on a functional level, are the trains running on time? When I push the start button, does it go power up? That's limited thinking. If you're solving the problem on a functional and social basis, a little better. But if we integrate all three, that's where the real value comes. So when it comes to the move, think, rest operating system, the functional value that it gives, it will lead to greater retention, higher engagement, and you will equip your leaders with strategic vision. Curiosity and creativity become learnable competencies, not just something that some folks are good at. The value of the move, think, rest human operating system from a social perspective is that it builds connection. You have now a shared language in your organization and you become mission aligned. It really helps you to build a human-centered time management process in a digital age. And here's the real value, the emotional dimension that move, think, rest gives. Emotional recovery is probably one of the underestimated costs in a time of so many layoffs, so many changes, so many mergers and acquisitions. We spend so much time on mental recovery and physical recovery. But the emotional dimension of the work that we have to do is what can sustain us or drain us. So the move, think, rest, human-centered operating system helps you, your team, your organization to focus on well-being and productivity as core to what you're doing. In other words, the so what of the move, think, rest operating system will help you to build curiosity and creativity as learnable competencies. You'll redefine productivity through balance. You'll shift to human-centered time management, and emotional recovery becomes a pillar. Don't you want to work in an organization that values curiosity, creativity, balance, human-centered time management, and emotional recovery? I know I do. Isn't that the kind of organization you want to build? The Move, Think, Rest operating system is one way towards that. So, how do you do that? Well, I am a big proponent of experimentation and prototypes because when we launch experiments, there's less pressure that it's got to be right out of the gate, right? You allow some room for error and failure, and you make it a little bit more fun. And what I am going to recommend is something that I write a lot about in Move, Think, Rest, which I call key performance experiences. You've heard of KPIs. Well, I'm going to equip you not just with key performance indicators, but key performance experiences. For example, I'm going to give you some practical ways to embrace experimentation and prototyping, to have a work share renaissance, to make sure that you're designing in time to think and ponder and not just be reactionary in the thinking of teams. And to consider the impact of sabbaticals and to measure every single one of these suggested KPEs. So, why does this matter? Well, according to McKinsey, 50 organizations that prototype and test ideas early are 50% more likely to successfully launch new products or services. That's a really beautiful outcome if you commit to prototyping and experimentation. And here's from the economist Amar Bideh: 90% of successful businesses, not just okie dokie businesses, but successful businesses abandon their original strategy. Why? Because they make time to do the movement, the thought, the rest, to reflect, to backcast, to forecast, to think critically, to leverage the technology to amplify what makes us uniquely human, to pivot and to adapt. So here's one. I'm going to give you three key KPEs, and then we're going to conclude. The first KPE I'd like you to explore experimenting with is micro play. Play is the ultimate move, think, rest experience. When we are at play, we engage. When you're at play, you're doing some sort of movement. You are forced to think very differently. Consider all the attributes of play. You have to be more experimental, collaborative, curious, empathetic. You have to negotiate. These are all of the sorts of modes of thinking that we say we want in our leaders, in our teams, in our organization, and we need to figure out how to incentivize that. So, for example, the founder of Nickelodeon, Jerry Laybourne, when she was at the helm, she used to institute recess, right? It was a time of no agenda. Everyone comes together. And when I interviewed Brendan Boyle, who is a toy designer, and he teaches a class on play at Stanford D School, I went out to Stanford, observed the class, interviewed Brendan. He talks about how valuable it would be if more leaders instituted this leisure time of play and to have rules. So, for example, you can't hog up the VP's time and no conversation longer than 3 minutes. But I'm not saying starting next month or next quarter, there's definitely going to be recess every week or every day. No, run it as an experiment. Select 1 week or 1 month where you can introduce these forms of micro play, track the feedback, track the level of engagement, and see what new sorts of ideas emerge based on conversations that people are having. Number two, and this is something I shared in July, question storm. So we've all heard of brainstorming. Begin to integrate curiosity as a functional attribute in the ways that your teams work. So question storming is a process where instead of generating lots of answers to a prompt, you generate lots of questions. And I like to encourage people to start with what if big blue sky expansive questions. So for example, it could be the first 5 to 10 minutes of a meeting. Let's say you don't have a lot of time. First 5 minutes of a meeting. If the topic of the meeting is next quarter's marketing strategy, ask people to take 90 seconds, 60 seconds even, and just quietly to themselves jot down 5 questions, what if questions around that marketing strategy. Then they share it with the person sitting next to it. You can do breakout groups on Zoom or Teams, and then share collectively. And what this does, it values the introvert and the extrovert, and it begins to democratize and merge ideas. Just start to redesign the way you meet and begin to normalize asking questions. This gets into the thinking dimension. And finally, getting to the rest dimension of the move, think, rest operating system, start to integrate pauses in the ways that a company like Zapier did, right? So Zapier is a tech company that instituted a get stuff done week. And in this week, they allowed people to pause. They put a moratorium on certain meetings. They allowed people to really do deep dives in the work that kept getting on the back burner. And the feedback and survey data from the Pause Lab showed that productivity nipped up a little bit. I write about this in the book Move, Think, Rest. And people were grateful to their managers and to the organization for seeing the need to help them to step back, zoom out, have a bit of a micro break, and trust that they would get the work done because they got the work done. So, what does a pause lab, micro play, question storming look like in your organization? What are small experiments you could do to start testing that out? If you want to have a deeper dive, you have a copy of Move, Think, Rest, but I encourage you to scan this QR code or go to the MTR_free bit.ly link and you can download the bingo card. It's a really fun way to begin to activate these activities for yourself and among your team on a daily and weekly basis. You'll also be able to join the Figure Eight Thinking Wonder Rigger newsletter, and you'll keep on top of all of my techniques and tips and articles that I write for Fast Company and my blog. So make sure that you scan that QR code and you also go to that link. So, in summary, how do you begin to do this? Well, start small. Start with small experiments. Don't throw the baby out the bathwater. Build in flexibility. Understand that things are going to go awry. State that from the beginning. State that you can adapt and shift midstream if necessary, just like I've learned to do in open water swimming. Make sure that you measure the impact. Do before and after. Do simple surveys. You don't need to boil the ocean. Make sure you create support systems amongst yourselves and amongst the teams that are participating. So there's also some accountability. And very importantly, celebrate the progress. Celebrate the failures and celebrate what you learned because of the failures. Make it into a party, incentivize it, have some fun with it. Because when people are at play, they are engaged. So so what of the Move, Think, Rest human-centered operating system is that it builds curiosity for consistent innovation. It shifts to a work culture of integrative, not just busy work and productivity theater. It helps you to shift to a human-centered time management process in a digital age. It helps you to elevate emotional recovery as a pillar of well-being. Creativity will become a strategic competency, and I cannot stress enough how significant this is in a time of ubiquitous technology. Just ask the World Economic Forum, and it will help you redefine what wellness is. And in my view, creativity is a wellness play. The future belongs to the imaginative, to the restored, and to the creative, according to me. And I hope I've convinced you of that at this point. So thank you so much. Make sure you scan this QR code so you can access the bingo card. And I think we're also offering a free chapter, which you can send to a friend or colleague, and you'll be signed up for the newsletter. So thank you so much. I will stop sharing my slides now. Are there any questions if you want to put those in the chat?
Thank you so much, Natalie, for your time and for all the information on Move, Rest, Think. It's just like a nice piece from going back to when we were all together in July. If anyone has any questions, if you can put them in the chat, or if you'd like to ask Natalie a question, if you raise your hand, we will enable you to be able to ask her the question. You might not come on the camera, but you can at least vocalize your question. So
I would love that. I love to hear the questions. Always helps me to learn and to see how the ideas are landing. Or a reflection based on anything you've heard today.
Give you all a second. Any questions? You can put them in the chat. Well, I
And
want
the
to
cat
be
does not go on. No
here's
questions
one.
inspired by the ideas, except experiment. Okay, wonderful. Thank you for the feedback. Glad you're inspired. Stay in touch. Let me know how I can be of assistance.
Okay, I do have a question here. Um, if your company does not offer sabbaticals, would you consider someone taking personal leave of absence?
I think that personal leave of absence versus sabbatical, I think it's worth first having a conversation to see if it could be considered as such. I know that personal leave of absence has it takes some different credits or so of your organizational stay. But it's certainly one way in. It's one way to ensure that you can get a bit of that and maybe, start small. Maybe it's not a vacation, but it's 1 week. And maybe, Bill Gates does these think weeks, right? Where he just indulges in reading. Maybe you could start small if you can't get the time away, during the Monday through Friday time. Could you do a fiction reading retreat? Just spend a Saturday or a Sunday where you're just reading fiction. So much of the research that I share in Move, Think, Rest shows that when we do these acts of thinking, reflection, physical movement that seemingly have nothing to do with the work at hand, it actually is sparking the same neural networks that we associate with creativity. Don't ask permission all the time. I like to say that, figure out your own way. How can you fit in? This is your life. This is your mind. This is your best work that you can show to your organization. And if you can have your own proof of concept that because you engaged in this, you were able to show up differently in XYZ project, hopefully the ideas will start to get more traction. Are there any other questions?
I don't see any more, Natalie. I think you've given people lots of great food for thought, and I think they probably take back and hopefully you got your QR code and we'll be able to um
Oh, here's a
oh,
question. Wonderful.
I'm I'm so precious about guarding my time so I can do free thinking. Any best practices that you would share?
So I mean, I think you are doing a best practice. You're guarding your time to do free thinking. I mean, one of the practices that I do that I write about in the book is to be intentional about setting in. I call it literally on my calendar is called buffer, right? So to make sure my assistant doesn't have me in back-to-back stacked Zoom calls or Teams meetings all the time, right? So it's sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes it's 30 minutes. So that's a practice that ensures that you protect that time. Now, here's another best practice. When you go to take that break, do not take this guy. Don't take your smartphone device. If you have to take it, put it in your back pocket, but don't listen to a podcast, right? Don't just have time away to expand on that sensorial dimension of who you are as a human being that is actually essential for you to do your best work. So that's a best practice that when you're breaking, you're not indulging in the tech, right? So because that scrolling is actually not giving your mind a break. So that's a really important best practice.
Well, she liked the idea of buffers.
Awesome. Yeah, that's something you can do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And I'm glad that if you can, you incorporate no meeting Fridays. And that's kind of a version of Zapier's get stuff done week. Again, whatever small ways it makes sense. Again, why is this important? To build your capacity for wonder and rigor so that you can consistently innovate, so that your team can consistently innovate. You will just continue to hit dead ends and burn out eventually if you don't do that. You're welcome. Thank you very much, Ravina.
Are there any other questions? Great. Well, then I also would like to say, Natalie, thank you so much for your time today, for sharing more information on Move, Think, Rest. And I want to thank everyone from the C2HR community for coming and participating on today's HR learning series. So thank you all, and I hope you'll have a wonderful rest of your day and have fun on Halloween.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Parthavi. Thank you, Tracy. Thanks, Ravina and Miriam, for your great questions. It was great to be here. Stay in touch.
Thank you, everyone.